Hey Next Economy Now listeners. We're so excited to share with you that we've officially opened registration for our fall cohort of the Next Economy MBA, which begins on September 17th. Our team created this course for listeners like you, the entrepreneurs, artists, community leaders, and other folks on the front lines of the Next Economy movement. Based on our 15 years of experience working with 300 different social enterprises, our 9-month facilitated cohort will provide you with a supportive co-learning community. Together, we'll explore the pitfalls of the business-as-usual economy, explore key business principles from a regenerative and just perspective, all while fostering the community and connection we need to stay resilient, inspired, and motivated in our movement for global change. If this sounds like it might be useful for you or a member of your community, we invite you to join us for one of our upcoming indoor sessions on June 11th, July 23rd, August 8th, or August 20th. Plus, you can save 20% when you register for the course before July 29th. Get started at lifteconomy.com/MBA. Thanks for listening, and now on to the show.
Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
Hello, everybody. My name is Erin Axelrod, a partner and worker owner at Lift Economy. And I'm so excited to be joined today by Natalie Foster. Natalie is a leading architect of the movement to build an inclusive and resilient economy that works for all. President and co-founder of Economic Security Project and Aspen Institute Fellow, her work and writing has appeared in the New York Times, USA, USA Today, Time, Business Insider, CNN, and The Guardian. Natalie speaks regularly on economic security, the future of work, and the new political economy. And she previously co-founded Rebuild the Dream with Van Jones. And she lives in Oakland, California with her husband and 2 kids. Natalie, welcome to the show.
Thanks. It's so great to be here.
Well, we're delighted to have you, and congratulations on your new book, The Guarantee.
Thanks.
I would love to start with you sharing about how you first got interested in the work you're doing today.
Well, I have feel like I've done this work for a while now. I'm the daughter of a preacher and grew up in Kansas and went to college and discovered organizing. And I think for a preacher's kid, you take to organizing somewhat naturally because you are trained to bring people together around shared purpose, trained to believe in a better world. I had thought a lot about God's love, and it was in college where I heard Cornel West say, justice is what love looks like in public. And it helped me understand the pursuit of justice is what I wanted to spend my life on. And so would get to do that over the next few decades as you just walk through my my resume. And I think, most recently it's really been about the American economy and how we build economic power for all Americans, regardless of race, religion, and zip code. That's what the book is about.
Well, there's a lot about our current economic system that could instill some despair, grief, racial wealth chasm, the failure to meet basic needs. But I'm curious, what are you most excited about right now? What's actually giving you a lot of hope?
Yeah, I am seeing so much momentum around the guarantees, what I call a guaranteed floor through which no one can fall. I'm talking the guarantees of housing and healthcare and family care and college, except all the economic, rights that we would need. growing around the country. And so I think that is what gives me hope. And undoubtedly, it's pushing against some really strong headwinds. The grief and despair that you are speaking of is, I think, something we all feel. And there's a lot of question right now, like, why aren't people feeling good about the economy when the economy is booming? The vibe session and pundits like pontificating about that. And it's so clear that, the last 50 years of policymaking have left us brittle in debt, and yet the economy booms on. And so it is so clear the chasm between the haves and the have-nots and an economy that actually works for all. So all that to say, I do think there are people shifting that. I think there is policy that is now mainstream that is shifting that, but it's just getting started. And so it gives me hope.
And what is Economic Security Project focused on? Are there initiatives that you're working on in particular to complement that trend you're seeing across the country?
Yeah, Economic Security Project started in 2016. Dorian Warren, who is president of Community Change, and Chris Hughes, who is a Facebook co-founder, and myself came together to launch Economic Security Project to build out first a conversation around putting money back into people's pockets through guaranteed income. And shortly thereafter would launch a body of work around reining in the concentrated corporate power and shaping markets to be more competitive and fair. And all together see our work as, building economic power for everyday Americans. So day to day, our work is putting money into people's pockets through a guaranteed income. And then right now, the way you see that playing out is tax credits across the states and the federal government. So the expanded child tax credit is an example of a guaranteed income where for 6 months after the pandemic in this country, every parent got a check into their bank account, debited directly, and got a taste of what the income guarantee would look like. So we work in states on tax credit modernization as well as a guaranteed income. And then we also work on shaping markets. We are focused on antitrust and anti-monopoly work, are excited to see just today as we talk, the Department of Justice and the FTC deciding they're going to pursue the monopolies that are currently on the AI stack, where, as we walk headlong into the AI revolution, it is all owned by a very small number of companies who did very well in the last tech revolution. And that doesn't set us up well. That doesn't make an economy that spreads the prosperity or that has competitive and fair markets for upstarts. So that's the kind of thing that Economic Security Project does.
Thank you so much. Wow. I'm thinking about some of our listeners might not know fully what guaranteed income looks like and also some of the benefits. And maybe there's some frequently asked questions that you get asked about guaranteed income. I'm curious if you could define it for us and also share some common concerns that you come up against.
Yeah, absolutely. Guaranteed income is this idea that there is a cash floor through which no one can fall, that there are regular checks with no strings attached sent to families. And that is an idea, some are excited about universal basic income, the idea that everybody would get the check. Others are excited about targeting the checks to people who need them the most. Either way, it is the idea that people deserve to live lives of dignity and freedom here in the richest nation on earth, and we can afford to do this. And so it started in sort of modern times with Mayor Michael Tubbs launching a demonstration in Stockton, California, of guaranteed income. And so 125 families in Stockton received $500 a month with no strings attached. And it sat alongside their wages. Any income they had, it came, regardless of what the rest of their lives looked like. It was something that they could count on. Around that time in Jackson, Mississippi, Dr. Aisha Yandoro launched the Magnolia Mothers Trust, which was run by a nonprofit in Jackson and gave $1,000 a month to Black women in Jackson to give them room to breathe. And that pilot has continued on and has really centered the Black women who are arguably the most vulnerable in the American economy. And Dr. Aisha Yandaro's thesis is, if we can build an economy that works for Black women, then it will work for everyone. And that is something I think is so important of an idea, such an important idea. And so from these two pilots, other demonstrations and pilots started to grow, and it got replicated around the country at a really fast pace. 60 cities, 100 cities. We're now at 150 demonstrations around the country of guaranteed income. It's about 50,000 people have been participants in these demonstrations across 35 states. So all of this is aimed at, hey, federal government, this is what policy can look like if we invest in the future of the social contract. And so that's guaranteed income. And as I put my head up and I thought, man, we have moved this, at rapid speed into the mainstream, I realized it wasn't just the guarantee of income. It was the guarantee of housing and healthcare and family care that were also spreading at very rapid clips. And together, that is a new paradigm and what I'm calling the guarantee economy. So that's a little bit of the history. And you asked about detractors, like what is the criticisms that we hear a lot? And, I think one of the criticisms is, well, people won't work. And if you give people checks, they'll stop working. And, I probably wondered that question myself. And the data has shown unequivocally that that is just not true. That people, in fact, are able to invest in themselves and find more meaningful work. In Stockton, for example, we found that people who received the $500 checks were able to find full-time work at double the rate as the control group. They were able to take time out to go to an interview, to buy a suit, to look for jobs that were nearby or had hours that actually worked with their lives. School ends at 3, for example. It's been really the opposite. And in fact, people have space to invest in themselves, to be entrepreneurial. And I think it really pushes against the definition of work, the very rigid definition of work that we have in this country.
Is so powerful. Thank you for sharing those examples and that there's data backing that up. Your book is so rich with stories, and I'd love to just be immersed in more of those. The story you just shared from Stockton was so powerful. Yeah. Are there other folks that you feature in your book, maybe around other of those guarantees that you'd like to lift up at this point?
Yeah. What I try to do is center the advocates, the activists, the organizers, the technologists, the thinkers, the doers who were moving these ideas forward. I feel like there's been so much written about the people who are most affected by bad economic policy. We know that 25 to 50% of Americans have nothing saved for retirement. You mentioned the racial wealth gap. We know that white families have 8 times the wealth of Black families in this country. I felt like a lot have been written about that. What I wanted to do was tell some stories of the advocates who believed a different world was possible. And so one is Tara Raghuveer out of Kansas City. Tara was a researcher with Matt Desmond, who wrote Evicted. His new book is on poverty. And she was researching evictions and he had studied evictions in Milwaukee for his book Evicted. And she wanted to bring that work to Kansas City, where she's from. So she was researching and sitting with, families who were right on the edge of being evicted. And why am I researching this? I know that this is a disaster to have left housing entirely up to the private market for the last 50 years. It is failing people. And, threw out the PowerPoint and started organizing. And she built the Kansas City Tenants Union, which would pass a Bill of Rights in Kansas City and grow to be a national federation of tenants unions across this country. And she's got one of the housing guarantee visions that have been, I think, very important for moving housing into the mainstream conversation, to recognize we have to protect the existing affordable housing that we have. We have to build and produce more housing. We are millions of units short in this country. And we also have to protect renters, the most vulnerable in the housing market. And so there's a lot of bright spots there, but that's the story of Tara and her work to move forward the housing guarantee.
Thank you so much for that share. And it makes me think about how tied, we work with an organization called the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, and how tied the guarantee of housing can be with civic engagement. Noni Session, the executive director, often notes that when people are rooted in place, they're far more likely to advocate for more policies that enhance that place. Have you seen any of those parallels, or how does that show up in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I would even say when people are rooted in place and when people have economic security, when there's stability. For a long time, I was enraptured with this idea of flexibility, that we needed to be able to be flexible in our lives, flexible work. And that is true. And it is a real advantage to a lot of white collar jobs. But the most important thing is stability, that people they know they have enough to cover an emergency should it come up. They know they have enough to provide for their families. And then on top of that, can engage in community, mutual aid, in civic institutions. And I think that the guarantees, which are largely about government providing a floor, would usher in a much more robust connection amongst communities and more space and time for the mutual aid and the community-driven work that I think is what makes life rich.
I'm so glad we're having this conversation, because many of our listeners also really adhere to the aspects or the levers around economic transformation that are associated with enterprise development. And you mentioned the antitrust laws that you're working on and the antitrust advocacy, but absolutely also need to transform government. And I'm curious if there's, in addition to these policy levers of instituting the guarantees, what are some really big picture, wave a magic wand transformation of government that you imagine in your most visionary moments?
Yeah, well, for so long, we have been told a story. This is really the sort of trickle down or neoliberal orthodoxy, which is total faith in the market, zero faith in government, and people, your job is to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And that was the reigning economic orthodoxy for my lifetime, and I think so many of us understood that to be like the weather, like that's American capitalism, and there's nothing we can do about it. It's like the weather, it just happens to us. No, it is a house we build every step of the way and outcomes that we plan for. So, I was just sitting with Mayor Tubbs from Stockton recently. We did a book talk in LA, and he's like, we have a guarantee. We have a guarantee of homelessness. It is guaranteed that if you leave housing entirely to the private market, you will have the unhoused. Just really was a provocative way of articulating, the old story. And so I think that in my most visionary, it's that there'd be a new story that says government is responsible for a floor, not the ceiling. People can still go hard and do their thing, but a floor, right? Raising the floor for everyone. That is what we should do right here in the richest nation on earth. And that's government's job. And that frankly, the other part would be, what is the purpose of the economy? And that the purpose of it should be human flourishing, that it should be dignity and freedom and presence, right? The ability to spend time with people we love, that should be what we're aiming toward. And the good news is that I don't think it's entirely theoretical anymore. We're actually seeing movements in this direction. We saw, for example, on the guarantee of healthcare, despite millions of people losing their jobs overnight, we actually had the lowest number of uninsured Americans in history during the pandemic. And that is because Medicaid and Medicare were there to catch people thanks to the Affordable Care Act that we passed 14 years ago. And it's not perfect by any stretch, but we saw government mobilize the National Guard to put vaccines in people's arms, right? We saw healthcare around COVID free. So we got a taste of what it would look like if we invested in a more serious, floor for healthcare in America. And, I give many more examples throughout the book like that just show that these things have happened in the United States now. There is a track record. A lot of it has been unwound from the pandemic, but it happened. And it was not it happened here under both a Republican and a Democratic president. And it's something we can do again in a more serious, sustained way.
What is the relationship between the federal government providing the guarantees, and I believe the pilots you're referring to might be happening at the more bioregional or local level? Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I see a lot of the guarantees being worked out in the laboratories of democracy, the cities and the states. A lot of the guaranteed income pilots that we've talked about are simply to point in the direction of this is what the federal government should do. The child tax credit, which is a step toward a guaranteed income for families with kids, is, every parent in America got those checks. And so that's where we need to be aiming, not a patchwork quilt of guarantees in these cities and these states, but instead nationally. However, it has to have momentum and start somewhere. I think in crises, it's an old Milton Friedman quote, actually, one of the godfathers of neoliberalism, who said, it's in a crisis, real or perceived, when ideas that are lying around are picked up and they're moved forward. And that is what we saw happen in the pandemic. Ideas were lying around. Ideas had been tested and tried in the cities and the states. So New Mexico, for example, just made childcare a constitutional right, free childcare in the state of New Mexico. That should be done federally. The state of Washington has a long-term care fund. They have figured out a way to guarantee long-term care in Washington state through a social insurance program. That is, a lot of people I know now are really stressed about this, waking up in the middle of the night thinking, how am I going to ensure my parents have care in their twilight years? It's unaffordable, and caregivers need to be paid wages that allow them to take care of their own families. And that is just a really hard market. Well, Washington state has figured it out. So let's take that model and expand it federally.
What would you ask our leaders, in addition to reading your book, what are things they can be thinking about, learning about, expanding their awareness, mobilizing their communities around? What are some steps that they can begin?
Yeah, I think one thing is just believing progress is possible, which can sometimes feel really hard today. The forces we're up against seem so big, and in many places our freedoms are being taken away. Violence is spreading, and it can feel hard. But Mariama Kaba has a quote, "Hope is a discipline." That feels accurate. It's not always easy. Sometimes you don't want to do it. Sometimes it's not that, but it's a discipline to believe it's possible. And so I think, voting matters. If we don't have elected officials that we can hold accountable to these visions who are, going in an entirely different direction, it makes it way harder. And I think joining something matters. We can't do this alone. And joining something, whether it be local movement for land trusts or whether it be an organization fighting for family care, or to, expand and modernize the child tax credit as a guaranteed income, join something that puts you in community with others.
As we start to close this conversation, are there maybe a few other stories you'd like to share, or any kind of parting words from your book that you'd like to lift up for our listeners today?
I think one story that's stuck with me is the story of the Debt Collective, We haven't talked a lot about the guarantee of college, but for so long, in the beginning, higher education was considered a public good, and it was often very low cost or free, largely for white students. And society thought it's good to have doctors and ministers, so we're going to educate our students. And as progress happened and campuses became more integrated, right around that time is when, essentially white supremacist politicians said, actually, hold on here. This is not a public good. This is a personal investment that one should make. One should take out hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt and make this investment in oneself, right? It was adhering to that neoliberal story of get government out of the way and let the market solve our problem and pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And so we entered an era where we understood college to be a personal responsibility. And now, as you and I talk, it has hit $100,000 a year in some places, which is just astronomically out of people's ability to afford it, right? And we know that this hits communities of color the hardest. And so I've just been really inspired by the people who've held the vision of debt-free college and have gotten us closer to that place than we've been before. And so one of the stories I tell is of Astra Taylor, who herself has a new book out called Solidarity and is a filmmaker and writer, just a really thoughtful human. And so around Occupy Wall Street, she and some colleagues, David Graeber, the late David Graeber, who's written a book called Debt and many other things, he and she started buying up debt on the secondary market and then relieving it. So you'd put in, thousands of dollars and you would actually relieve millions of dollars from the compounded interest. And it was proving we could do this. We can end debt for people. But they realized actually it's got to be policy change or this is just pennies. And so, but policy change requires organization and sustained power building and pressure on the system. And so they started the Debt Collective, which is a union of debtors, college debtors, home debtors, renters, medical debtors, and are addressing the shame that comes from having that debt, the shame that comes from that neoliberal story of bootstraps, as well as the power that comes from collective action. And so worked on the idea of private for-profit colleges, which was the tip of the spear of the industry, got a lot of those closed down, got some of the first debt canceled in the United States. And now, fast forward, we're at a moment where it seems like every other month, this administration announces billions more in debt that has been erased, abolished from college debt that has been abolished. It is now like a Rose Garden event at the White House, which shows government has a role in making college a public good. These are the kinds of things we can do, and it has material impact in people's lives. You go from paying hundreds of dollars a month, every month, to a bank, to having that money yourself for your own life, for your own hopes and visions and dreams. And it's, I talked to somebody recently who said, I have never thought I could own a home. And all of a sudden, I was part of the last tranche of debt forgiveness, debt cancellation. And I have vision now. I dream of something that I could do with that money. So that is changing people's lives and starting to tell a new story of, higher education as a guarantee. And so that's one that I leave with you.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for taking the time and sharing that. And so I'm also kind of feeling into this vision or dream of what could be possible collectively in the space if that amount of collective resources, rather than going to support debt payment to banks, could go towards commons provisioning of housing and community-owned solar, community-owned farming cooperatives, and another piece to throw in the mix around getting us free.
That is so well said. I've been thinking a lot about freedom, inspired by my friend Mia Birdsong, who is taken on a project to reimagine freedom for the next 100 years and how it is actually about interconnected freedom. Our freedom to be with the people we love, to build with the people we love. And if we are working hand to mouth if we are working 3 jobs to put food on the table, we can't do that. We aren't free. And so I just really appreciated her reclamation of freedom, and it sounds like your own digging into freedom as well.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today and for all your perseverance and movement building. And just really let us know if there's anything we can do to collaborate or support you, and keep up the great work.
Thanks. Thanks so much for having me on.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.